welcome to PSEG True Diversity Film Series. My name is Donna Walker-Kuhn. I'm Senior Advisor, Community Engagement. And tonight, our topic is violence, empowerment, and allyship, the Asian American experience in America. This panel will discuss hate crimes against Asian Americans and how these have increased during the pandemic. Violence against Asian Americans is not a new phenomenon, but this current resurgence demands a response and to explore how we can be allies. The discussion this evening is one that our Social Justice Committee felt critical to discuss. The Social Justice Series is part of our Standing in Solidarity initiative. The purpose of this series is to bring our community together and to encourage everyone to take part in the movement to ensure civil rights for all. Since June, New Jersey Performing Arts Center has presented a series of events and initiatives focused on promoting racial equity. On our website, you can find archived prior social justice panel discussions, as well as resources that will help you to take action. We're also happy to have as our advisors the Newark NAACP, New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, Newark Arts, and the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Center at Rutgers University. NJPAC would like to offer a land acknowledgement, and the language we're using was created with consultation and guidance from Chief Dwayne Perry of the Ramapo Lenape Munsee tribe and Oleana, Whispering Dove of the Eastern Salagi Algonquin descendant. And we're grateful to them for their generosity, wisdom, and labor to craft these words. We, the Lenape, original benefactors of land once ripened and cultivated with attentiveness to the Creator and her ascendancy, express everlasting gratitude to our Creator for the traditional ancestral jurisdictions of the Munsee, Esopus, Canarsie, Capsee, Werpos, Silanoy, and Weekasqueak, jointly known today as the Ramapo and Nanticoke Lenni Lenape. We are the Lenape Hoking today, and we will be for the remaining days of tomorrow, keepers of the past. Let this moment of recognition be a monument of action. Let it be the beginning of hope for this, our Turtle Island, and for the Ramapo Lenape, the Munsee people of whose land we now trod. Here on this land, in this place of the Munsee, we acknowledge our debt to those who have come before us, to those who have been denigrated and suffered for the sake of cultural and land appropriation. Let this, our land acknowledgement, be the beginning of our return to unity. Let us be guardians of the water, the air, and the earth, the four-legged, the flyers, the swimmers, the crawlers, the mammal people, and the green. Let us now stand lifting our humanity and rapturing with Earth's consciousness as guardians of harmony and kindness. Our corporate sponsor for Standing in Solidarity is PSEG, and I am pleased to introduce Priya Varma, who is the Manager of Talent Management at PSEG, providing support in the areas of enterprise-wide talent strategy, human capital management, and talent marketplace development. Prior to this role, Priya has held various positions of increased responsibility in PSEG's Service Corporation, as well as PSNG, where she focused on providing support in the areas of benchmarking, metrics, and advanced analytics. Priya's vision is to become a leader committed to making a difference while pursuing continuous personal and professional development. Welcome, Priya, and thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Welcome, everybody, to tonight's event. I'm Priya Varma, Talent Management Manager and a very proud sponsor of PSEG True Diversity Film Series. Our company, Public Service, and the PSEG Foundation are pleased to be a longtime partners with New Jersey Performing Arts Center. PSEG was among earliest supporters of NJPAC and the True Diversity Film Series, which represents the best of that relationship. This series reflects PSEG's commitment to Newark, where we are more than just another utility and more than just another company. Public Service has made our headquarters in this community for the past century and then some. We'll be marking our 118th anniversary later this year. We are proud of our commitment as citizens of Newark and as citizens of New Jersey. A tremendous part of this commitment is our support for organizations such as NJPAC and what their support means for diversity, for education, and for the arts. Last summer, in the wake of the tragic killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis and the demonstrations that followed in cities and communities around the country, PSEG and the PSEG Foundation announced another commitment, the Power of Equity and Social Initiative. This initiative is PSEG's Foundation's $1 million commitment to support organizations that addresses the racial injustice, inequality, and human rights in communities of color in New Jersey, New York, and anywhere PSEG operates. PSEG has had a unique and a special relationship with many diverse communities we serve, with Newark at the top of its list. When one of us is impacted in PSEG community, we all feel the impact. That's why it's essential that we all join together to act and build a framework of equity, compassion, and respect that will truly benefit us all. We believe our long-lasting support for diversity, education, and the arts help us contribute to that ideal. Now, it is my honor to welcome all of you in this important event. Thank you for being here, and please enjoy the discussion.
Thank you, Priya. Let's meet our moderator for the panel this evening, Professor Rose Cuizon-Villazor, Vice Dean and Professor of Rutgers Law School. She's an expert in immigration, citizenship, property law, race, and the law. She's a nationally regarded scholar with an active record in social justice issues and is the founder of the Rutgers Center for Immigration Law, Policy, and Justice. Dean Cuizon-Villazor teaches, researches, and writes in the areas of immigration and citizenship law, property law, Asian Americans and the law, equal protection law, and critical race theory. Her research agenda explores legal structures and systems that determine membership and sense of belonging in the United States. Welcome, Dean. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and welcome everybody to our panel tonight. I am deeply honored to have been invited to moderate this panel. Before I set the stage for tonight's conversation, allow me to first introduce to you a recorded video by Congressman Andy Kim. Congressman Andy Kim was first elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2018. He represents the 3rd Congressional District of New Jersey, which stretches from the Delaware River to the Jersey Shore, encompassing most of Burlington County and parts of Ocean County. Congressman Kim grew up in South Jersey, the proud son of Korean immigrants, where he attended public K-12 schools before becoming a Rhodes Scholar.
Hi, everyone. I'm Congressman Andy Kim from New Jersey. I want to thank the New Jersey Performing Arts Center for pulling this together and giving me a chance to be able to share with you some of my thoughts. This is an incredibly important issue about the challenges and the concerns and the discrimination and the bias facing the Asian American community. It's also an immensely personal issue to me, and it's one that I'll be very honest with you, I've been grappling with and struggling with a lot over the last couple weeks and months, as have many people around the country. For me, this issue is one where it just reminds me how much of a deep cut we have in our society. That the challenges that we face, the discrimination, the racism, it existed before COVID, it'll exist after COVID. But we've certainly seen gasoline poured on the fire over the last year as we've seen these horrific attacks, including the shooting down in Atlanta. I was invited down to Atlanta 2 weeks after the shooting by the victims' families and by the Asian American community down there. It was one of the most powerful experiences of my life. And to see that raw emotion, the hurt, to go to the 3 different sites of the shootings, to trace the steps that this murderer took as he hunted down victims and sought out targeting Asian-owned businesses. It was a lot. And I remember someone asked me there, what are we actually going to be able to do about this? You know, they expressed their fear, their just palpable fear that they had. And, you know, it was tough because I don't have an easy answer to that. Yes, in Congress, we're taking some steps towards passing legislation that will help move the needle. We're about to pass the COVID-19 hate crimes bill. We have a No Hate Act. Both of these are about investing into efforts to be able to combat against hate crimes in our country, to be able to better understand and research and analyze and document hate crimes, but also to be able to respond. So that's a step. But I know that legislation alone is not going to stop this. We're trying to figure out all the different ways that we can connect in. I think about all the ways in which it's affected me. I mean, I shared recently a story about how when I was a United States diplomat working at the State Department, how I was banned from working on issues related to Korea just because I'm Korean American, and how hurtful that was. It was this feeling that my country didn't trust me enough, that they worried that there were limits to my loyalty to this country. That kind of foreignness, that feeling of foreignness constantly hovering over me and my family and others, it's exhausting, and it's so tiresome after 50 years of my family being here, 3 generations, that we still experience this. I had my oldest son, my 5-year-old, come home one day, tell me that a bigger kid kept calling him Chinese boy over and over again. And he's 5 years old, and just he was so confused. He didn't understand what was going on. That is again just another example of just this foreignness, of just being seen as the other. So yes, we're going to pass this legislation. We're going to try to take more and more steps and work to strengthen the support we can provide to the AAPI community. I want to make sure that we're taking steps to empower people to get engaged, to make sure that they can find their voice and be heard and seen. We also need to make sure that we build that allyship in the same way that I and my family and many others marched in protest in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. It's meant a lot to have so many people in different communities of color step up and help us out too. So we need to keep that up. I ask you to continue to learn about API history. Great way to start is this PBS documentary, 5-part series online. You can stream it online on Asian Americans. Great way to learn a lot, and try to find other ways to just stay engaged and involved, and to listen and make visible these challenges that are faced. So thank you again for everything. Look forward to staying in touch, find ways to connect more. Take care.
With those powerful words by Congressman Kim, let's go ahead and officially begin our conversation tonight. As I am joined by 3 phenomenal speakers, after I briefly introduce each of them, I'd like for each of them to give just a 1-minute overview of the perspective that they would like the audience to retain from our conversation tonight. Jamie Liu is a professor of sociology at Rutgers Newark, who studies education, immigration, race, and ethnicity. Her book, Asian Americans in Class, Charting the Achievement Gap Among Korean American Youths, was published in 2006. Lucia Liu, the founder and CEO of Rock the Boat, a podcast and community organization focused on Asians who challenge the status quo. And Yolande Ski, a multimedia artist and documentarian, and the author of the book, When Newark Had a Chinatown. What we hope to do tonight is to offer some historical background, then discuss specifically issues regarding resilience and allyship and empowerment, before providing some concrete action steps that all of us can take to support the AAPI community. So let's go ahead and begin. As Congressman Kim noted, it would be helpful for us to have a historical discussion. And so to start us off, I would like to ask Professor Jamie Liu to give us just some brief historical background about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Like people of color, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have been othered. Asian Americans in particular have been viewed as perpetual foreigners. And no doubt a big reason for this is due to federal laws that excluded Asians from immigrating to the United States. So Professor Liu, could you give us a little bit of background regarding why this is the case? Why the stereotype of Asians as perpetual foreigners, and the other.
Thank you, Rose, so much for that introduction. And thank you to NJPAC for really holding this important panel. I guess I will jump right into history and then maybe talk a little bit about the three key things that I would like to take away, for us to take away from this panel discussion today. The first, just going into very briefly about what I'd like to highlight, is that the Asian American history in the US is really marked by a long legacy of racism, exclusion, and resistance. So these historical events are officially and legally sanctioned racist policies that resulted in generations of marginalization and systemic oppression. The second critical point that I'd like to make today is really to discuss the social construction of Asian Americans as model minorities keeps this white supremacy alive while reproducing the systemic racism intact. So how this racial positioning of Asian Americans have been critical to filling temporary cheap labor force in the US while denying them privileges of civic legal membership by keeping them perpetual foreigners, aliens, and non-Americans. And the third point that I'd like to really take away is that Asian American communities can build alliances and coalitions across racial groups to resist oppression and fight for social justice. This isn't new to our community. This has been in existence since the 60s for sure, and before then. And therefore, I think today is particularly in light of everything happening, we really need to step up again. So without further ado, I'll just go very briefly into the history component. And of course, it's hard to do this in 5 minutes. So I will try my best, Rose, and maybe everyone can fill in later on. So throughout the US history, depending on key economic and geopolitical shifts, Asian Americans face racism, exclusion, and even internment. So as many of you know, Asian Americans have been in the US since the 1800s. Beginning in mid-1850s, when young single men, mostly recruited as contract laborers from southern China, Asian immigrants have played a vital role in the development of this country. Now, working mostly as miners, railroad builders, farmers, factory workers, and fishermen, the Chinese represented 20% of California's labor force by 1870, even though they constituted only 0.002% of the entire US population. So this just goes to show you how actively the Chinese laborers were recruited for these very specific labor needs that the US had. And with the Depression of 1876, however, amidst the cries of course, they're taking our jobs away and Asians being used to break labor unions against other working class whites, as well as other minority groups, including African Americans, anti-Chinese legislation and violence raged throughout the West Coast. And so since then, they endured generations of officially sanctioned racial prejudice, including regulations that prohibited immigration Asian women, for example, in the Page Act of 1875. This is critical to note because part of this act really was to make sure that Asian communities would not settle in the US permanently, and therefore really being able to settle down and start family. This was an important part of keeping Asians temporary and excluded. This led to the Chinese Exclusion Act, of course, of 1882, which barred all immigration from China, Immigration Act of 1917, and the National Origins Act of 1924, which extended the immigration ban to include virtually all of Asia. Fast forward, it led to the forced relocation and internment of about 120,000 Japanese Americans after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. So what is important to remember, though, the large-scale immigration from Asia really did not take place until the passage of the landmark Immigration Act of 65. The removal of racial quota, it instituted family reunification, and specifically recruited for professional status of Asian immigrants to fill the labor needs again, right, in STEM fields in the midst of the Cold War. So all of these are really important to know in the ways in which Asian American population has changed. And then sort of over the decades, this modern wave of immigrants from Asia increasingly been recruited for and became more skilled and educated. So today, recent arrivals from Asia are nearly twice as likely to those who have come 3 decades ago to have college degrees, and many go into high-paying fields such as science, engineering, medicine, and finance, again, because these specific immigrants professionals were recruited for these specific labor force needs in the US. In the same way, in the global economy of the 70s, the low-skilled service economy was also growing, and that also recruited other low-income service sector immigrants from Asia as well. So what you have is this evolution really spurred the changes in the US immigration policies, but also labor markets by political liberation and economic growth in the sending country and the forces of globalization growth. So much of this really speaks to the diversity, this wide-ranging diversity of social class, of ethnicity, as well as immigration histories among Asian American communities. And then lastly, I just want to contextualize where we are, and then I'll stop, is that Asians is nearly, at this point, including the foreign-born and US-born adults and children, it's recorded to be about 18.2 million in 2011, according to census. That's about 6% of the total US population. This compares to less than 1% of the total population of Asians prior to 1960s. So in the aggregate, Asian Americans really only consist of about 6% of the total population. Nevertheless, the increase of the population prior to 60s is very dramatic, as you can imagine, from 1% or less than 1% to where we are today, which is hovering about 6%. So I'm going to end there, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about this, but that just kind of gives you some context for the Asian American immigration today.
Thank you very much for that historical overview. I do wish that we had more time to talk about the nuances of all those specific laws on the federal level, because they did collectively lead to barring Asian Americans, Asian immigrants from coming to the United States, and denying the ability of Asian Americans who were here to develop family ties and a larger network. But it's not only federal laws that sought to exclude Asians and Pacific Islanders from our borders, but also within our own state and within our own localities. Here in the city of Newark, we too experience exclusion through local laws. And so I'd like to ask Yolande Skeet if you would just talk about this book that you wrote about when Chinatown used to be in Newark. Can you walk us through some of the history that you uncovered and the story that you tell through the book about Chinese Americans in Newark? Yolande, if you would just unmute, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you mention the perpetual foreigners concept along with the others? You know, Asian Americans are considered perpetual foreigners, they're considered model minority, they're considered the others. And one thing about this country is we have a lot of terms that we put our third world people into. When I first started the book, I was not thinking about writing a history of Newark. I was just satisfying my own curiosity. I'm Asian, African, and European. And the Asian part of me is pretty heavy because I grew up around the Asian part of my family. When I was writing the book, I found that the psychological stress that families suffered had reached down even into the current generation, the psychological effect of them having come from China to work on the railroads and then having to split to all these other parts of the country to find more work. There was a lot of negative information. I went to the library, I couldn't find anything but drugs, illegal immigration arrests. And even the librarian who helped me to find the material was a little ashamed to bring out so many arrests information, drug information, all saying that the Chinese were negative. This made me even more curious because I couldn't believe that that could possibly be. Then I ran into a friend of mine named Bob Lee. A lot of you probably know him. And he told me that he was born in Newark. And I thought, oh, well, Bob Lee was born in Newark. I should ask him about it. And I did. And the information he gave me really helped, because then I actually went to the houses in the neighborhood to talk to people. In Newark, the Chinatown Newark, Blacks and Chinese lived side by side. Blacks supported the Chinese restaurants, but they were not allowed to eat in them. So some had separate dining rooms for Blacks. Many restaurants hired young Black girls as waitresses, and many laundries hired Black women to do the folding and the ironing or whatever needed to be done. They're in Chinatown now. This is in the downtown area. You notice that all the Chinatowns are in downtown areas, but there's a reason for that. And the reason is that that's where all the ironing and the laundries had to be, to clean up all the shirts that all the politicians and the people that work downtown had to wear. And it was also the place to build the restaurants because they had to eat. There were Blacks, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos, and some Portuguese and a few whites or Caucasians. There were quite a lot of Black and Chinese marriages or relationships, and a lot of Asian Black children. Why did Newark Chinatown die? I'm gonna go through this very fast. I'm gonna back up a little. How did they get to Newark? They got to Newark because there was a steam laundry in Belleville, and the man who owned the steam laundry had Irish women working for him who were striking all the time. You hear this kind of story about a lot of the places where Chinese came after the railroad to work. It was always to replace someone else, or because there were strikes going on, because at that time, America was just beginning to have small unions, and they really weren't unions like we know unions. They were just groups of people, like the Irish had theirs, and the Poles had theirs, and the Italians had theirs. Okay, so they brought 68 Chinese. They agreed to get 68 Chinese to come from California to Belleville. Well, the man in Belleville who had the laundry built an enormous wall around the laundry because he didn't want anyone to know he was bringing all these Chinese in. Not only that, he had the train arrive in Belleville in the middle of the night, so no one would see them, so they wouldn't be a problem. The train, however, was late and arrived in the middle of the day, so the Chinese had to walk through the streets and ask, where's the laundry? And it didn't turn out so bad, People always expect the worst. The people were very glad to tell them where they were, and they were like really excited, a little afraid, but they didn't kill them or anything. They just told them where to go. And so the Chinese went to the laundry and started to work. They actually celebrated Chinese New Year's there for about a number of years, at least the first 5 I found records of. When they moved to Newark because there was a lot of problems with the staff. It wasn't the owner of the laundry, it was the staff that they had the problems with. The owner of the laundry didn't pay much attention, but he had like foremen who did not like Chinese. And so they picked on them in relation to, oh, this piece isn't ironed well enough, this piece, take it back, blah, blah, blah. So the Chinese would just take it back and do it again. But every once in a while, they'd single out one particular Chinese person and be very cruel, throw them out, and the rest of the Chinese would come in and want to attack the man, and they'd have to get through all this haranguing. Then there was the gambling, of course. Well, Chinese had to gamble because they couldn't come out of the laundry and go to the movies. They couldn't come out of the laundry and go hang out at the bar or anything. They had to do something. So they gambled. It took me a long time to find all the information because the Chinese that lived in Newark, Chinatown left. They left after the riots. And when I tried to find their names, I had to go to church records to find their names. Of course, they thought I was crazy when I told them I wanted to find out about Newark, Chinatown. And they didn't want to talk to me. It took me 2 years to get to some people, you know, writing letters. And then finally, when I got to them, it was like they were so overjoyed. Somebody wanted to give them some attention. They were going to have their history written about. They were very, very excited. So I got all these personal stories and I put them together. And I met Baraka Sele, who they had just gotten a, which is NJPAC. They had just, at that time, she was working at NJPAC. They had gotten a humanities grant, and she suggested that I apply for their humanities grant and use that to finish the book, which I did. After the riots, the Chinese pretty much decided that they were going to move out of Newark, and they did. Not because the riots came down as far as Newark, Chinatown, because it didn't. And not because they didn't like Black people or because of any other reason than they wanted to move up the ladder, number one. Number two, they were being raided a lot. You know, there's 52 weeks in a year. 1 year they had 52 raids. Can you imagine 52 raids? That's once a week. The CIA, oh, well, it wasn't CIA, it was the FBI. The FBI comes in with the police, smashes your door down, and comes in, and you have to find your immigration information immediately. If you can't find it fast enough, they drag you out. If you were gambling, even though it's your own house, they drag you out anyway. So they began to get sick of this treatment. So they left. There was also another fact that after the Depression, like everywhere else in the US, Chinatown had gone down. And they moved into a lot of other places in New Jersey that would be considered middle class, lower middle class, whatever, because that was what they were aspiring to. They wanted their children to go to colleges and get degrees and rise up. And since the war was over, there were a lot of the Chinese men had fought in the war, and they were able to take advantage of the veterans' education, buying a house, that kind of thing.
Yolande, thank you for that. And I'm sorry to cut you off. I want to make sure that
Okay.
we'll go back to some of the history that you mentioned, but like I just wanted to pause there because what the story that you tell about Newark is so important because it connects us to the ongoing racial inequities that we are experiencing today. So we're understanding that the laws of Chinatown and Newark is set within a larger framework of racism in this country that is tied to immigration, as you're talking about with raids, and then with the specific federal laws that Jamie mentioned earlier. I'd like to give us, to move us just a little bit more towards understanding better some of the differences among Asian Americans ethnically. Asian Americans are not a monolithic group. It's also important to understand their historical migration when the differences perhaps in generation. So Lucia, I'm wondering if you can tell us just a little bit more about that, how we might be able to better understand the Asian American community, generational differences, and perhaps ethnic differences among the Asian American population.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I just want to preface that I'm not an expert like Jamie or Yolande are. I host a podcast. It's called Rock the Boat. We highlight a lot of Asian Americans who are challenging the status quo. I think I'd like to answer that question by first talking a little bit about my own personal heritage, right? So I am generation 1.5. Apparently, it's very confusing for most Asian Americans to figure out what generation you are, because the definition of what generation you are is kind of in flux. But so far, according to Wikipedia, from the last time that I checked, right, it's that you are the first generation if you came to the States when you were 12 or older. That makes you first gen. If you come to the States 12 and younger, then you're 1.5 gen. If you were born in the States, then you're second gen. If your parents were born in the States, then you're third gen, right? And so I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about, first of all, to your point, Rose, that Asians are not a monolith. Like, I think just amongst the four of us here, we're all from various backgrounds, right? And Yolanda, it's awesome to hear that you come from such a mixed background, right? And that's just to show that the diversity of Asian Americans that are here from an ethnic perspective. I believe there's across Asia, there's like 2,000 languages spoken. I don't know how many ethnicities are in the United States in terms of Asians, probably like over 100 at least. So just within that scope, there's so many different ethnicities and so many different languages spoken among us. Now, if you cut a little bit deeper and actually look at the generational differences, therein lies also differences in the way that we think, right? If you're first generation, or if you're a modern day parachute, as people would call it, and you came from China for high school and then stayed for college and then got a job here, you're very different from somebody who's third generation, parents lived in Hawaii or lived in California. So your mindset is very different. Similarly to how you've immigrated to the States, right? So on the podcast, we've interviewed a number of different people, and some of their parents immigrated the same way that my parents did. They came for school. So my dad came here for a PhD. Jamie, he was one of the people that was part of the engineered folks that were pulled over because of his educational background in electrical engineering. But in speaking with some folks whom I've interviewed on the podcast, they have a very different story. They have a story where they and their parents escaped the Vietnam War on a boat and came to the States with really nothing. Or I've heard stories of people who are second generation or third generation whose families will tell them not to adhere to their cultures, right? So their grandparents were part of the Japanese internment camps or met during the met in an internment camp, and then later on told their kids, hey, don't learn Japanese, don't speak the language. And I think that just shows how diverse and the breadth of diversity that is currently here within America for Asians living here in America. So I think just to your original question around, what should people take away from this conversation? The thing that I want people to take away from this conversation is this, oh, I didn't know that moment. The moment where they felt like, oh, that's something new that I've never thought about. Or, oh, if you're Asian American, to think, oh, I've never thought that way about my culture or my identity, or how I should think about my identity. The other piece around just, I think, diversity, it's just it's a funny question, right? Because you think about in America, when we talk about Asian Americans as not a monolith and diverse, you think, oh, Chinese people are different from Filipinos, who are different from Vietnamese people, who are different from Indians, right? And it's super ironic because I am still very deeply connected with my Chinese heritage and my Chinese culture. And so even within China, you think about the diversity within China, like I think 55% of Chinese people are Muslims. They like within just the country itself, Northerners are different from Southerners. My husband's from Hong Kong and I'm from Shanghai. We don't even speak the same language, right? So it's kind of insane to think about just how much diversity there is and how it's kind of crazy to be able to lump all of these different people into one specific population. Yet it's nearly impossible not to, because we still make up such a small percentage of the US population, right? Jamie, you alluded to that percentage. Right? I think we make up 6.5 to 7% of the US population in total. That's nothing compared to, African Americans or Latinx, or even though we are one of the fastest growing minorities here in the United States. So there's, I think, a lot to think about here as to why we are under this umbrella designation of Asians in America. But I think it is also very nuanced. And because of all this diversity within our own community and population, it's really hard for us to come together as well. So I think the silver lining to, unfortunately, a lot of the violence that's happening currently is that we are seeing people come together and we're seeing allies reach out. And, I really want to thank Donna and JPAC for putting this together and giving us the platform to speak about something so important.
Thank you. So this is a really good segue to talking about the ways in which we Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have been lumped into one category, and addressing some of the stereotypes that Yolande mentioned earlier, the model minority stereotype, for example. So why don't we turn there and speak a little bit more about how Asian Americans, either as a group or individually, have been pushing back against some of these stereotypes. So perhaps we can begin with the model minority stereotype. Jamie, could you start us off there?
Thanks, Rose. Sure, I'm gonna kind of try to do my best to contextualize this as well. But so throughout the U.S. History, Asian Americans were actually vilified and villainized, often subjected to horrendous racial violence, right, as the sinister yellow peril, Mongoloids, Orientals, Gooks, and the N-word, depending on where they were being pitted. This is absolutely historically in place for Asian American communities. What is significant to highlight, though, it was really in the 60s, during the height of civil rights movement, that the term model minority was actually coined for Asian American communities. And I think this is a really important point, and I'm going to sort of support this with a couple of evidence here. But I want to argue and kind of show and illustrate, one, what does this model minority stereotype do, right, in the ways that Rose just mentioned? And also, how and why did it really come into place during this particular time in the civil rights in the 60s? So since the 60s, journalists, politicians, and scholars alike have constructed Asian Americans as model minorities whose cultural values of diligence, family solidarity, respect for education, self-sufficiency, right? All of these sort of values, which has basically been used to announce how Asian Americans are, quote unquote, achieving and successful in our society. Of course, the flip side of the same coin is the argument in comparison, of course, to other racial minorities who did not have these cultural values, right? So the model minority and the culture of poverty argument are truly the flip side of the same coin. And this is really important for us to kind of unpack. So just to highlight a couple of things, I'm going to talk about the US News and World Report in the 66 that coined the success story of one minority group in the US to talk about Chinese during that time. And then, of course, the New York Times 1966 talked about Japanese being model minorities. New York Times article 1970 talked about Japanese joining Hawaii elite. 1971 Newsweek success story outwhiting the whites And then 1975, the Americans of Japanese ancestry, fast rising sons, and model minority. I mean, you can just literally see the litany of all of these kinds of terms that really hit the mainstream news. I want to quote one particular excerpt from the US World Report in 1966. It really encapsulates a lot of these things that I'm going to unpack in a minute. So in quote, it says, "At a time when Americans are awash in worry over the plight of racial minorities, at a time when it is being proposed that hundreds of billions be spent to uplift the Blacks and other minorities, the nation's 30,000 Chinese Americans are moving ahead on their own, with no help from anyone else, winning wealth and respect by the dint of his own hard work." End of quote. So you could imagine if you start to unpack this narrative, this really capsulizes the entire modern minority discourse. So what we really want to understand here is, of course, by the dint of hard work, individual meritocratic notions of individualism, Asian Americans are doing it, unlike the Blacks, who clearly don't have, right, these kinds of cultural values. So in the midst of this time of civil rights movement, what was really important to note is that Asian Americans have actually been building coalitions with the Black Power movement, with the Chicano movement, with the Native American movement, in all ways to kind of really fight for social justice and civil rights movement. The myth of modern minority came at a very particular time, right? When Black Power movements were starting to gain momentum, when the politicians were trying to undercut those movements to say Asians have experienced racism in this country, but because of hard work, they've been able to pull themselves up out of racism by their bootstrap and have the American dream. So why can't you, African Americans, Hispanics, Native, et cetera, et cetera. So in many ways, what we see here is that it's a driving wedge between Asian Americans and other communities of color, primarily the Black Americans during the civil rights, and it uses perceived Asian American success to invalidate claims of inequality towards white Americans. And it's also reinforced a structure in which assimilation to white society is the primary goal for other ethnic groups. So really, what are the key problems? There are many, right? But I'm going to highlight a couple. One, it essentializes Asian Americans with fixed culture, as if it's not fluid, as if it's not depending on all these issues that Rose and Nisha and Yolanda have mentioned. It negates variability within Asian American communities in terms of class, ethnicity, language, immigration history, achievement. It ignores important structural factors completely, right? Of racism, classism, sexism, immigration history, by talking about individual cultures, right? It completely negates these kinds of structural factors to talk about individual meritocracy. And in doing so, what does it do? It keeps the individual ideals of meritocracy alive. And in doing so, it keeps the white supremacy ideals of these racial kind of formations very much rooted and intact and reproduced over and over again. So in pitting Asians against other minorities by noting that Asians are good minorities versus the bad minorities of Blacks and Hispanics. But think about this, it's good minorities, right? Bad minorities, right? The basic idea is that it's never, ever, ever talking about whites. It's in the context of the normalcy of the white backdrop, and while all the minority groups are vying for limited resources and building coalition that is basically now obstructed. So it keeps the structure of white supremacy and racial hierarchy intact, and it undermines, prohibits solidarity and coalition building. It is a problem, but it's so effective. And historically, it's happened over and over again. So the fact that Asian Americans have been coined modern minority in this mainstream way, particularly in the 60s and the height of civil rights, is really critical for us to remember going forward, how we can actually learn from that and actually mobilize in order to really counteract this sort of really rooted notions of white supremacy and hierarchy that's continually kept alive in our society.
I'd like to say something to that.
Oh, sure, of course. And then I just want to, like, I saw that Donna raised her hand. So if I can just kind of contextualize the conversation here, and then with respect to the way in which Asian Americans are being pitted against other racial groups, and in particular African Americans. And as we, we're hoping to be able to talk about allyship and collaboration, but let's just talk a little bit more about this prescribed conflict using the model minority myth. Yolande, was that something that you were hoping to address?
Yes, that's
Great.
exactly what I want to address. The model minority idea was not really positively accepted by any of the other minority groups. And at no point do I recall did any of the Chinese community come out and say, we are not the model minority. Aside from that, the civil rights movement, or actually what I should say, the Black Power movement, because that's what it was. The Chinese didn't join the Black Power movement until everybody else had already joined the movement. Even the Chicanos joined. The Japanese were the first Asian group to join the Black Power movement, okay? And then after that, the Chinese came in, but most of what they did was in their own communities. And I'm not saying that's not great, that was great, but they were not out there getting shot at. They were not, maybe one or two of them were, but they were not out there out front. Now, none of them became members of the Panther Party, for example, but there were a lot of Chicanos and Mexicans who became members of that and participated along those lines. I'm not saying that that was actually bad. I think the Chinese culture as a whole is one that caused this kind of a separation between Chinese and Blacks. Chinese people do not make noise, and it's because they're afraid. And part of the reason they're afraid goes back to how they were treated after the railroads were built and they had to go and find places to live. And all along the history of the Chinese in America, they were not well treated. So I can understand why they want to be quiet. But then there's also the fact that their culture suggests that they sit down, treat their kids in a certain way so that the kids learn. They come from a culture that doesn't have racism like the Black people have. They were not enslaved, they were not in chains, and they don't have what some of these psychologists have called the PTSD that Black people have. Okay, so they're mentally in a different place. They can get jobs. If you go to get a job and there's a Black and a Chinese person, the Chinese person's gonna get it before the Black person. It's always been that way. When I came to America, it was the same thing. Who am I? Am I Black? Am I Chinese? Who's gonna accept you? It wasn't the Chinese. And another thing about the Chinese is they're very organized. They're very organized. In Chinatown, now I see homeless people in Chinatown, but I never saw homeless people in Chinatown all the time that I lived here. The Chinese took care of the Chinese. And that's why they didn't have to bother with the outside world. So they were like in a very secure situation. Whereas Blacks, Mexicans, all these other groups, they're much more vulnerable. So I think the Chinese need to teach or find some way to pass this information on so the other groups can know how to live in America. Because we're all in the slave mentality, caste system that Wilkinson, have you read Wilkinson's book? Wilkinson has just written a book called Caste, and it's the most incredible breakdown actually of what we are in this culture. And if we don't get this together, even Asians are not going to be able to get past this big lump of, massive stuff that's thrown at us. We don't need an anti-Asian hate bill. We need an anti-everybody hate bill, because everybody is hated by white people. I didn't see any Asians on January 6th. I didn't. Did anybody see any Asians climbing up the fence? I didn't, Anyway, that's my take on this whole thing,
Thank you, Yolande. I think you're right to say that we need to dig deeper and try to better understand the different histories and experiences of various Asian American groups, and also how they relate to the African American community. Here's where I think it's important to further understand something that was noted earlier about within the Asian American group, anti-Blackness that seems to be part of, at least resides within Asian American Pacific Islander communities. Lucia, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the work that you do through your podcast. How, in the conversations that you've had with different Asian American individuals, how has the topic of anti-Blackness come up? And how have you navigated that space within the AAPI community?
Yeah, so Yolanda, thank you for your passionate speech and for calling it out and for addressing it and acknowledging what you had just said about one, it sounds like, Chinese people kind of live in their own bubble, right? And two, it's that they don't like to speak up. I think there's so many different aspects to those observations, and they're absolutely true in a sense, because I think if you look at Chinese history, if you look at every just for thousands of years, it's people are separated from the ruling class. And the ruling class is each dynasty probably lasts anywhere from 250 years to 500 years max. And so there's just this constant churn of ruling class. And the funny story is I recently watched this video of a Chinese professor explaining what happened in the Qing dynasty right before the fall of the Empress Dowager Cixi, right? Right before China kind of became taken over by the KMT, and then later on the Communist Party of China. And the funny story is that there's 8 countries coming in to storm the capital of China, and all the normal people that lived near the capital were oh, well, these countries are coming to fight the capital. They're not coming to fight us. So they just open the doors wide, right? And let these countries just storm the palace. So there's always been a disconnect between the people and I think the ruling party or the ruling class. So that's number one. Number two, I think just from a when you said something about oh, parents kind of teach their kids something, these certain things, and then just move on, right? And don't teach anything about racism or a broader scope of things. Education is just so ingrained within the Chinese culture. If you look at history, it's the way out of poverty for Chinese people, the way out of anything was getting educated, and there's I don't know what it is in English, but you would have to take the it's the imperial exams, right? So you would take the imperial exam. So this is centuries and millennia of teaching, and that's so ingrained within the culture. And I believe that comes too with people kind of immigrating and coming to a different country. For them, they could be thinking about it as, hey, I'm coming to a country, I just need to survive. I just need to survive. I need to survive. I need to survive. And so we talk a lot about this on the podcast about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? When you first immigrate to a new place and you can't even put food on the table, or you're just in survival mode, you're on this lower echelon, right? You can't really think about anything else besides food and shelter and food and shelter. And so I think there's a bit of that as well. With that all said, I feel extremely lucky because, unlike my parents, I never had to worry about surviving in this country. I'm as 1.5 generation, I came here when I was 3. I learned the language. I'm able to live here. I got naturalized when my mom got her citizenship when I was a teenager. never really had to like, fight for my rights, so to speak. And so like kind of growing up in that environment, I'm on a higher rung of Maslow's hierarchy where, to me, it's not as important to like safety and, putting food on the table isn't where for me, it's like a reach goal. For me, a reach goal is like more along the lines of self-actualization and being able to like do something and make an impact. And because I have that privilege, I was able to start the podcast and speak with some really amazing people. And, frankly, like before Black Lives Matter, I never had to think outside of that. I really just thought about, hey, from a personal perspective, as an Asian American, there's like a few different career paths that you can take, right? Like you can, it's like Asian parents either want you to be a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer, and they don't really appreciate it if you go into the creative arts or start your own business or do something a little off the beaten path. And so, with that understanding, I started the podcast, and a year and a half in, the George Floyd incident happened, and I started looking around my own peer group, and I noticed that I didn't have any people who were African American or Black. Like I didn't have any friends who were African American or Black. And so that's how it kind of prompted me to start educating myself and learning a bit more about racial dynamics in the US, and started reaching out to a number of different people, and invited them to have conversations and just open up the dialogue. And I think the first thing that I encountered was that, hey, anti-Blackness in the Asian American community is real. Like from a personal story perspective, my parents live in Shanghai. My mom reads a lot of
Lucia,
like
I'm so
Chinese
sorry
news.
sorry
Sure.
to cut you off
I know we
too,
have to
but
wrap up.
I
Yeah.
yeah. Well, and it's such an important topic for us to really understand anti-Blackness within our own communities. And then if we had more time, I would have loved for us to talk more about the collaboration that that we've seen historically in the 1960s that Yolande mentioned. But we have about 10 minutes left, and I'd like for us to turn to the topic of the specific topic of today with respect to the rise in anti-Asian violence. Just to kind of set up the stage, as everyone knows, on March 26, 2021, 8 Asian Americans were killed in Atlanta, Georgia, drawing national attention to the rise of anti-Asian violence in this country, particularly since the pandemic began. Although, of course, it's important to note that this violence, as Donna mentioned earlier, is not new. This violence against AAPI communities is not new. There have been several incidents historically, from the 1871 hanging of 15 Chinese men by a white mob to the 1982 murder of Vincent Chin. But according to the nonprofit organization StopAAPIHate.org, since the pandemic, and let's say we'll use March 2020 as the starting point, between March 2020 and March 2021, there have been more than 6,600 incidents of anti-Asian harassment and violence. And these incidents range from verbal harassment to physical assault, civil rights violations, and online harassment. More women have reported being subject to harassment and violence than men. And so there's a larger question that we need to examine. Why is there a rise in anti-Asian violence? And then I think more specifically, what can we do about it? Congressman Kim said that we can pass these laws, but that's not enough, right? We need to look within the community. We need some allies. So I would love for each of you to spend maybe just 2 minutes giving us some, 2 to 3 minutes, just giving us some points from your own perspective, maybe drawn from your own experience. What do you think we can do to address the rise of anti-Asian violence? So I'll start off with Jamie, and then Yolande, and then Lucia.
Well, my goodness. I mean, we have so much work ahead of us. I guess it wouldn't surprise you to hear me say that for me, I think one of the most important things that we need to do as a community is to really build coalition across different racial groups. This is really important. And I think that it's, in some ways, building this alliance and coalition building across racial groups for social movement, particularly around racial justice and social justice issues right now is probably one of the most important things we can do. I think based on everything that we've already talked about so far, the ways in which these sort of hate crimes have played out, as you all mentioned, it's not new. It's going to continue to play as long as these sort of racial positioning continue to take hold. And I think that part of what we really need to think about is in building these coalitions, though, across different racial groups, we need to bring people together and talk about what are the actual issues that are going to both kind of connect, where the issues are that we could actually connect on, as well as the issues that might be divergent. That's a real challenge. And that means that it's recognizing the distinct sort of issues around Asian Americans, at the same time, recognizing that there are these shared issues across different racial struggles and oppression that really does actually become closer by working together, we actually become stronger. I just want to point out one quick thing about Pan-Asian American identity, because I think it is relevant for this discussion, is that the term Asian American really, in terms of political place, it only came into place in 1968, right? The idea of Pan-Asian American identity was really to coalesce around specific issues around social justice and racism to ensure that we have such limited resources to fight for. So the idea was to coalesce as a group to fight for these injustices. And that was really important to put the public face forward, in addition to building coalition across these racial groups, right? But the challenge is to make sure that the variability within these groups that we all talked about is not lost, it's discussed, and the complexity of these issues are continually upheld. And so I think that's really, in my opinion, that's one of the most important things we need to do at the moment.
Thank you. Yolande?
Well, the first thing I think we should do is drop the anti-Asian hate bill. And it's very divisive, in my opinion, and make it an all immigrant hate bill, all people of color, an anti-brown people hate bill. Because, okay, yes, those Asian women were killed by a white man, but most of the violence in this country is against Black people. And now we have Black people attacking Asians, and it all goes back to Trump. And then it all goes back to jobs, because that guy who attacked that woman, he could have just lost his job because of what Trump said and this whole Corona thing. We're not looking at the causes of stuff, we're just reacting. We can't just keep reacting every time something happens. We have to look at the core of what's going on, because we're all suffering from the same disease. Asians are not separate from Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans. We actually totally leave them out. We've got to get inside the whole thing. We have a lot of Asians going into political roles. We need to send them out into the community, send them out into the areas where all the minorities are, and let them, all the minority groups see that, oh, Asians are coming in. They want to talk to us. They want to be a part of the whole thing. That's what they should have done in the 60s. That's what they should be doing now. Why didn't Asians really do a heavy protest when Trump said that? They should have had a kind of Black Lives Matter or Asian Lives Matter or whatever. We didn't start this virus heavy duty march on the Capitol, something like that. I think everything has to be rethought out. And you're right, we need to meet with other groups. And that's what these new politicians, and I'm really glad you got this program, Lucia, and I really impressed with what you said, because what you said is absolutely truth. And I'm sorry that we didn't have time to go on.
Lucia?
That's okay. We could always save time for more because, as Donna mentioned at the beginning of this chat, there's so many things that we can talk about here. The few things that I think we can do, one, take bystander intervention training. If you don't know what that is, it's a really awesome program where basically it teaches you to do something when you see something, right? And at least you could learn to document the situation or diffuse the situation, or help somebody in some way, because there's too many times where I've heard, an old person got pushed down in the street or spat on, or somebody got assaulted and no one did anything. Right. Like, I think the worst was when I read an article that some woman got peed on in the New York subway, and nobody did something, like no one did anything. So just if you see something, do something, take the bystander intervention training. That's the best way you can help. To Jamie's point on coalition building, I think we need to stop competing, like talking to each other as if we're competing for resources and that this is a zero-sum game. It's like a minority Olympics against white supremacy. Like, it's not, right? We should all band together and fight for our rights and fight for what we think we deserve and fight for the freedom that America has quote unquote promised us. Right. So it's not an oppression Olympics. It's not who has it worse. It's, time right now currently is that we are experiencing violence in the Asian American community, and that's the focus right now. And maybe unfortunately, if that happens to Latinx later down the road or something like that, like, we want to stand up for them. So I think we need to take issues one at a time and stand up for each other when they happen. Include AAPI in diversity and inclusion talks at companies. So I firsthand am seeing how a lot of Asian American issues are not taken up by companies. Did you know that minority-owned business designator for small businesses does not include Asian Americans, does not include East Asians, and that's wrong, right? And so the last two things I think you can do is just learn more. PBS documentary is great. There's so many resources out there for you to listen, for you to digest and to think about. I saw a question around if you're not Asian American, how can you ally? Start conversations. Be like Donna. Invite us to have these conversations, to have these talks. Invite Jamie to have a conversation with your organization or team or whatever group of friends, so that she can share all the amazing knowledge that she shared on today's call. Right. So just talk to people, start those conversations, build those bridges, because, coalition building takes time, and you can definitely just do it one person at a time.
Thank you. So there are several, and then to respond to one of the questions, as an African-American woman, how can I be an ally? So we received some concrete examples here, whether it's coalition building, ensuring that Asian American issues are part of a DEI training, bystander intervention. And I think Yolande suggested looking broadly at white supremacy, and that should be an overall project that many of us should be engaged in. I personally see the anti-Asian violence as one of a number of different responses that can be done. I think it's that particular bill that passed the Senate and is currently being reviewed in the House is a response to the lack of understanding and lack of knowledge and really lack of intervention with respect to the Asian anti-Asian violence that we're seeing. So it's one of a number of different actions that all of us can take. And I understand that there might be a range of responses with respect to that bill. I completely agree with Yolande that what we need to do is understand better how all of us, all the different minority groups or minoritized groups have a connection with respect to how we are othered, and we are all collectively viewed as perpetual foreigners in many different ways. What I would like to do is show a brief film, just a 5-minute video, to help us understand. This is, of course, a program sponsored by NJPAC. And the arts is one of the different, is one method of understanding how Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have been treated differently, either by law, society, and hear through films. And so the concept of Orientalism is explored in this 5-minute video to help us understand better where film has helped to promote and perpetuate stereotypes, but also where film and the arts can help combat those stereotypes. So if you could please show this film for us, and then we can have hopefully a few minutes of conversation to wrap up the program.
Weeks ago. You cannot go on or keep ringing my bell. You disturb me. You must have a key made.
I'm Raj. I'm a Bollywood producer. I'm looking for the most delicious thing on the planet.
So what if there is an America beyond Orientalism? I think all of the speakers here have shown that there is an America like that beyond Orientalism. And so we are now at 8:20. And what I would like to do is ask each of the panelists if they would like to share some final thoughts that they would like the audience to remember about today's conversation. Lucia, please go ahead.
Well, I love that video. I was just about to ask like who created it. I think it's really heartwarming to see that the former examples were a little older, and then the what if examples are actually very new. So it's good to see that media is changing and coming around to seeing Asian Americans as more human and in a lot more faceted ways that we all are. I think that, we talked so much in this conversation about, allyship and addressing the fact that, yes, there's more for us to do, that we can't stay silent, that there is this model minority myth. But I think that we as a community are very strong. And I think that more and more so we're all coming together. And more people are kind of waking up to the fact that they need to do something. There's been so many times when I had conversations with folks either on or off the podcast at work, outside of work, where people say, prior to all of this happening, prior to COVID, I was just happy doing my own thing and living in my own bubble. But after everything that's been happening, the violence against Asian Americans, I realized that I have to do something. And I think that really gives me hope that, everyone who's listening in, late night on a Monday is here to either learn something or to do something. So I'm excited for that future.
Thank you. Yolande, would you like to go next?
I don't really know what to say after all this. I wish, are we going to have time for outside call-ins and things like that? I'd be curious to know what the people who are listening are thinking about and get some questions from them. I think the basic thing that I get from all this and I would like to see is inclusion, more friendliness. If we have to put groups of people in our neighborhood to make sure that nobody gets, attacked. We did that in the 60s. We did that in the 60s and we can do it again. And in the 60s, it wasn't just one group of people doing it. It was each group of different groups. As a matter of fact, we did it in 2000 something or other. We were having rapes in Newark, and we were able to call in the Black Berets or the Green, whatever those young people in the Lower East Side. They had a group that, anybody remembers them? We were able to call them in to come and help us keep our neighborhood safe. So those are the things we need to do. And we do them with the people in the neighborhood, or usually a whole group of mixed people, not just Asians. They're, a lot of minority people. And we're not a minority.
Thank you. Jamie?
I think I've been such a downer with so much. I think I'm going to kind of end with thinking that we actually have so much opportunity for change. I do think this moment in time is really an exciting time with a lot of potential for really change in our society. And I want to say that I have so much faith in the new generation, particularly the Gen Z. I think that there's a level of engagement of these issues in depth that I haven't seen in a very long time. And I say that, both having taught many of the students in my classes over the years, but also just my own daughter, who's a teenager, and the level of the engagement that they are involved in the social justice issue is really, really it really is very encouraging. And I think that there is this level of really seeing these connections that I've talked about in much more nuanced, but also deep way that I haven't seen in a very long time. So I have a lot of hope that we can actually do some some pretty big changes in the coming years.
Yeah, I too am hopeful, and I'm hopeful because places like NJPAC and PSEG are sponsoring these types of events to collect all of us, to bring us all together. And I'm grateful for the audience who are here tonight. I know there are at least 2 questions or suggestions for us to have a part 2 of this. There's so much more that we can cover, as I'm sure you're able to figure out based on our conversations and the responses that we got here. There are questions about what about the Harvard-Stuyvesant struggle around admissions and affirmative action? How can we explore further the relationships among Chinese Americans and African American relationships, particularly in Yolan's work? So there's so much more that we can cover. Unfortunately, we don't have that time tonight, but we're hoping that we can continue this conversation at another time. So thank you, all of you, for joining us tonight. Thank you to Yolan, Jamie, and Lucia, and to Donna, and to all the others who supported this event, Priya, for being here with us tonight. And thank you, all of you, for joining us. Have a good evening.
And thank you, Rose, so much for moderating this panel. This was
Yes.
really informative.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank
Yes,
you.
echo that.
Thank
I
you,
just-
Donna.
You're welcome. I just want to close out our wonderful panel. Oh my goodness, each of you, I felt like I was in college. It's so wonderful to learn from you. Well, thank you for sharing your experience, your insights, your brilliance, and thank our audience for your attendance, your participation. So I just would like to remind everyone, please join us. This week, we have, as always, an amazing array of events. Wellness Wednesday will salute our Asian American Pacific Islanders month. So every Wednesday in the month of May, we will have dance instruction from different cultures and countries from the Asian and Pacific Island culture. So it's going to be a lot of fun. They're free Wednesdays on Zoom. So we just look forward to seeing you there. And of course, next month, we will have, the end of this month, we have another Standing in Solidarity event, which will be on Monday, May 24th at 7. And the topic there is economic justice, poverty, injustice, and racism. And it's based on the documentary Rust. And so again, we continue to explore these social justice topics, and we thank you all very much for your participation. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.